Good evening, everyone. I hope you all are doing well and your preparation is going good. So today I am back once again with another important live session, which is a part of our 50 days live session, where we have been discussing various important topics from across your GS papers, and I have been extensively covering important topics from GS2. So in that series, let us today discuss another important topic, which is the separation of powers, the bedrock of Indian democracy. So as I told you that this is a part of our 50 days mains live sessions, where we will be conducting specific discussion on important topics, why these topics are important, what are the current affairs related to these topics, the PYQs, previous year questions, and what type of questions can be asked from these topics, which basically and specifically helps you in your mains preparation journey. So we have also been running differentiator batch for essay course, and we have also been conducting mains test series. So you can reach out to us and basically do take our test series, and you can practice writing answers based on the questions that we have prepared, and we will evaluate your answers and will give specific comments, which will be immensely helpful for you to basically improve your answer writing skills. We have also been conducting ethics course, which I have been conducting. So if you wish to join the ethics course, you can reach out to us. You can follow the Google form that will be circulated in the course of this video, and you can drop your comments and feedbacks or queries, and our team will get back to you and will help you with your specific query and concerns. So without wasting much time, let us straight away come to the topic for the day, which is the separation of powers, the bedrock of Indian democracy. And while we will be talking about the separation of powers, we will also be trying to understand the interconnectedness of this particular topic with the GS papers of both UPSC and APSC, right? And which therefore will help you in your preparation, whether you are preparing for APSC mains or UPSC mains. So I think this session is going to be immensely helpful in your preparation. And if you have joined this session late, then what you can do is that you can like our channel, you can subscribe the channel and like this video, and do leave your feedbacks and comments after the session, so that we can actually work around your feedbacks and comments and accordingly come up with other important topics based on your feedbacks and requests. So the doctrine of separation of power, as we all know, was offered by Montesquieu, and this doctrine of separation of power basically divides governance specifically into three branches: legislature, executive, and judiciary. And such division of power basically ensures that there are checks and balance with regard to their functioning, and in the Indian context, this doctrine of separation of power basically lays down the foundation for the constitutional democracy, right? And in the process is actually promotes the accountability, and most importantly it helps us prevent the authoritarian tendencies, right, that any of the branches otherwise can turn, and it may actually cross its jurisdiction and therefore work or function in an arbitrary manner. But such checks and balances basically helps us limit them and to ensure that they actually do not cross their definite given jurisdiction. Now, why this is important, that any of the branches does not actually cross the given jurisdiction, for that we can understand that by referring to James Madison's quotation, where he says that the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So what is tyranny? When all the powers basically are concentrated in one hand, right, then the system becomes tyrannical. And therefore, if the democratic functioning of a state is to be maintained, then the adequate distribution of power, the separating the powers between different branches becomes all the more important, and to ensure that these branches do not cross their jurisdiction and arbitrarily enter into the domains of others, right. Now, as we have said that this concept was basically conceptualized by Montesquieu, and therefore it allocates distinct functions to the legislature. For example, the primary role of the legislature would be lawmaking, executive would be performing the task of implementing that particular law which has, let's say, been formulated by the legislature, and the judiciary will again perform another important task of law interpretation, which is the laws which have been made by the legislature would be analyzed and reviewed by the judiciary, so that it can be ensured that there is no power concentration. As James Madison has rightly pointed out, that if there is concentration of all that power in one hand, then it can actually be very basis of tyranny, and therefore in our democratic system we cannot allow that, and therefore we will understand that in the Indian context we have actually adopted a modified separation of powers, right. The concept of modified separation of power, which is to say that there would be functional independence. Let's say with regard to their specific functions, they will have independence, but at the same time there will also be interdependence, right. Whereas these three branches are independent in their respective domains, but at the same time there will be interdependence amongst these branches, and they have to basically work in a collective harmonious manner. So what are the key features therefore, right, of the Indian conceptualization of this separation of powers? Then we will get to know that we have the constitutional division of roles. For example, Article 50, separation of judiciary from the executive. Article 21 and 211, they again try to maintain the independence of the judiciary by ensuring that the conduct of the judges are not discussed in the parliament and the legislature except when there is removal motion against these judges. So it in that sense ensures that the judiciary enjoys the required independence so that they can perform without coming under the pressure. Checks and balances to ensure accountability. So we have the checks and balances, and these checks and balances basically ensure that there is accountability. And judicial independence, which actually I have already pointed out, that judicial independence as a cornerstone of democracy. Now a flourishing democracy must therefore protect and ensure that there is independence of the judiciary. Now let's look at the in brief, let's look at the historical evolution of this concept, how this separation of power has actually come up. So we have the Regulating Act of 1773 and the Government of India Act 1935. This basically laid down the foundations for institutional separation, right. So they have basically separated the institutions in that sense, though there was in this framework what we had was there was heavy centralization in that sense, so it was heavily centralized, and the the British exercised greater control, so the provinces did not enjoy that much power. Now when we look at the Constituent Assembly, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the chairperson of the drafting committee, the architect of Indian Constitution, basically advocated for checks and balances so as to safeguard democracy. And this so he believed that in order to protect and ensure that democracy can function in its true spirit, the certain checks and balances were very much important and they were very much required. And in the post independence, basically in the constitution, the Indian Constitution basically formalized the separation of powers through Article 50, judicial independence, as I already pointed out, Article 122, 211, 212, which is the legislative autonomy, which grants more autonomy to the legislature, and the executive accountability to the parliament, right. So this way the separation of powers has been formally constitutionalized through the constitution after the independence. Now we need to talk about these various branches. For example, legislature. What is the primary task or function of the legislature? Which is the law making, right? And therefore, executive, oversight of executive and budget approval. So these are the important tasks that the legislature basically performs. The key provisions, when we look at, the legislative autonomy basically prohibits judicial interference in the parliamentary proceedings, so that the judiciary cannot unnecessarily intervene in the proceedings of the parliament. So that provision is there, which basically grants more autonomy to the legislature. Then we have, the legislature also has the power to amend the constitution through the Article 368. As the highest law making body, basically the parliament has the power to amend and the constitution through the Article 368. Then we have checks, so as to ensure that this power is not abused by the parliament, right? We have the judicial review of laws. So the laws passed by the parliament can again be reviewed by the judiciary. Now the judiciary, because the judiciary plays a very important role as the interpreter of the constitution. So its role is to look into the whether the laws passed by the parliament are constitutional or not, right? If they are unconstitutional, then those laws, even when they are passed by the parliament, can be declared null and void. So this way there is a check on the legislature. Though the constitution grants larger autonomy to the legislature, and when we say legislature, both parliament and state legislature we are referring to. So though the constitutional provisions have granted greater autonomy to the legislature, but yet there are certain provisions through which it has been ensured that the legislature actually does not abuse the power at its disposal. Now executive, the role of the executive is basically policy implementation, right? So administration and governance. And what are the key provisions? It is executive is basically accountable to the legislature, as we have already pointed out. President, governor as the nominal ceremonial heads acting on the ministerial advice. We all know, though president is the head of the state, but the president is generally referred to as the nominal or the ceremonial head, and actually the real power is basically used by the prime minister, because prime minister heads the council of minister, which is basically there to provide aid and advice to the president. So here again you have checks, so that executive does not abuse that power at its disposal. We have judicial oversight, for example, and then secondly, so many of the actions of the executive has to pass the judicial test, and then we have parliamentary control via no confidence motion. So the parliament can again have greater control over the executive, just in order to ensure that the executive doesn't abuse the power. So D.D. Basu basically in his book, Introduction to the Indian Constitution, which is again a very important book for your GS2, says that, underscores that executive accountability as a democratic, safeguard. So executive accountability is very important for upholding democracy. Now judiciary, now the third branch basically. Now what is, so when we hear basically the Supreme Court and High Courts, so what is the primary role and function of the judiciary? Judiciary basically works as the guardian of the constitution, interpreter of the laws, and protector of the fundamental rights, right? So it is the guardian of the constitution. So if tomorrow parliament actually violates the spirit of the constitution, as the guardian of the constitution, the role of the judiciary becomes very important. It must come forward and protect the very spirit and the essence of the constitution. And we will also get to know how the judiciary has from time to time performed that role with all its seriousness. Now what are the key provisions? For example, as I already pointed out, that judicial independence, and for that, for the judiciary to perform that role, it becomes immensely important that the judiciary actually is granted that independence, okay? And what are the provisions in that regard? That that security of tenure, fixed salaries, and so on and so forth, right? The power of judicial review is again another important power that the judiciary exercises, which is through Article 13, Article 32 and 226. So the High Court. So next, but then the question may arise, so can the judiciary actually be become overactive, over enthusiastic at times, and therefore enter into the domain of other branches, and therefore this doctrine of separation, what will happen to the doctrine of separation in that context? So this kind of questions may also come up in our mind. So for that also we have certain provisions. For example, we have legislative impeachment of judges. So there are established procedures through which the impeachment motion can be introduced against the judges. Of course there is a specific provision for that, and we need to follow that. And sometimes we also have that some of the judgments are actually overturned by the parliament through subsequent other constitutional amendments, and that way we have seen that many times the judiciary and the parliament, or let's say the judiciary and the legislature, have actually faced each other in that sense, and which is generally referred to as the conflict or the tussle between the judiciary and the legislature. Now, as I told you that we need to look at whether the judiciary has actually played its role as the guardian of the constitution, as the protector of the fundamental rights, right? So there we can refer to the landmark Supreme Court judgments, and one of the most important judgment in this regard is Kesavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala 1973. We have already discussed about this Kesavananda Bharati case. We have also prepared some short videos on that. So if you are interested to know about the basic structure doctrine, then you can follow the CSAP IS Academy YouTube channel, and there you can go and look at the certain short videos where you will get crisp and concise content on the doctrine, on the basic structure doctrine. But nonetheless, so it established the basic structure doctrine in the Kesavananda Bharati case, and affirmed the separation of powers as the non-amendable feature of the constitution, because tomorrow otherwise this provision of separation of powers can itself be changed by the parliament. So what do we do in those circumstances? So therefore it has been actually regarded that it is a non amendable provision of the constitution, and the separation of powers in that sense is also one of the basic structures of the Indian constitution. And therefore this landmark judgment, what it has done is that it has limited parliament's amendment powers basically with regard to amendment to the constitution. Now the parliament does not have the absolute power, right? The parliament does have the power to make changes through the constitutional amendment. Parliament can make changes in the constitution. However, in doing so, the parliament cannot violate the basic structure of the constitution. So separation of powers is a basic feature of the constitution. Now another case, S.R. Bomai versus Union of India in 1994, it basically curbed the misuse of Article 356. As we told you that many times the executive can also abuse the power, and therefore there needs to be mechanism, there needs to be specific provisions through which this abuse of power can be effectively curtailed and addressed. And for that many a times the judiciary has come forward, taken note of such cases or instances, and therefore has said that the course correction needs to be done, and this power, the exercise of this power granted under Article 356 is also subject to judicial review, right? And therefore in the process, in this S.R. Bomai case, basically the judiciary reinforced that federalism and reinforced federalism and executive accountability, that the provision of federalism is important, and that the executive also is accountable. And now basically what we have is that in other cases, for example, we can now bring the reference of the NJSC, for example, National Judicial Appointment Commission. So where the parliament wanted to have a control, the legislature wanted to have a control with regard to the appointment of the judges. However, in that particular case, the judiciary declared that constitutional amendment as null and void, declared it as the unconstitutional, and therefore retained the old collegium system of the recruitment of the judges. With regard to the recruitment of the judges, the collegium system was reaffirmed. right, emphasizing the judiciary's role as a counterbalance to legislative and executive powers, and therefore it again highlighted that the judicial independence is the cornerstone of democracy, and therefore any control, with regard to the recruitment of the judges can actually hamper the very independence of the judiciary, and therefore if the independence of the judiciary gets compromised, it will largely affect the functioning, and the spirit of the constitution may also be defeated. Now let us try to briefly look at, and understand how this particular theme or topic can be related with other other papers. For example, GS paper 1, history and society, from that constitutional evolution and historical underpinnings we can look at. So India's journey from colonial rule to democratic republic was marked by institutional development based on separation of powers. So it is not that all of a sudden the concept of separation of power has come to us. There has been this, for a long period of time there has been, a direction in the journey in that direction, and therefore Government of India Act 1935 laid early foundations of federalism, which I already told, and the functional division of power. The Constituent Assembly also then, assembly structure and debates basically where Ambedkar specifically advocated for it. This also reflected the demand for independent judiciary, powerful legislature and accountable executive. And when we look at the emergency era, as the historical milestone, then we have emergency, which is the historical instance of institutional breakdown. Let's say when this the separation of power or this harmonious balance, when it is violated in a way, and when there is some kind of an institutional breakdown, so the disruption of the separation of powers basically led to the suppression of civil liberty. So you see, whenever there is this harmonious balance of separation of powers, or the doctrine of separation of powers gets compromised, it has larger impact on the society. It has larger impact at the level of the society, and we have experienced how civil liberties were compromised, were suppressed, and this is now actually studied as a societal trauma and the historical warning, right? And therefore we can always link, this way to the GS paper 1, which basically deals with history and society segment. Now similarly GS 3, economy, internal security and disaster management, there also the internal security and federal structure are also interconnected. The law and order is constitutionally a state subject, but what we find is that often the center makes an intervention vis-a-vis this particular provision when through when the basically center makes provisions like NIA, APSPA, okay, and this actually reflects the structural asymmetry in power sharing, that it is not very even with regard to the sharing of the power, and there is unevenness, and obviously there is a tilt towards the center, so the center is more powerful. So in this doctrine of separation of powers, as we already told, that though there is certain independence with regard to certain jurisdictions, but there the power is more at the hand of the center, so center exercises more power, right? And this basically at times poses the challenge, this kind of asymmetry many a times poses a particular challenge to the principle of separation of powers in the internal security governance, right? Center state conflicts, for example, with regard to CVI, jurisdiction withdrawal, reveal challenges to separation of principles in security governance. So many times the various states have resisted, they have said that they will not allow the CVI and other central agencies to enter into their state, and they need to take prior approval and so on and so forth. So therefore it also refers to the kind of tussle which is going on in this scheme of arrangement between the center and the state. So the ethics paper, now again, as we know that ethical use of power is very important. When we study ethics, it tells us to make the governance ethical, and when we are supposed to make the governance ethical, the functioning of the three branches of the governance becomes important, and how they use that particular power, whether this particular power is used ethically or not, that becomes extremely important for us to understand. And that's why we can actually connect this theme with the GS paper 4, which is the ethics, integrity and aptitude. And we at CSAP IS Academy have been conducting a course on ethics, which I have been actually teaching this ethics paper, and I have been providing detailed guidance on this paper and how to master this ethics paper, which will eventually help you not just in your mains, but also in your preparation for the interview round. Because you might have seen, when you look at various mock interviews, you might have seen that many of the questions that are asked to the aspirants in the mock interviews are basically based on their understanding of this ethics paper. They want to test their knowledge and understanding about the ethics paper, their attitude towards the governance, why they want to become a civil servant, for example. So all these questions are flowing from the ethics paper, and that's why it is very important. Now, misuse of governors discretionary powers. Now you see, we have provisions for discretionary power. Of course, in India we also have rule of law, and rule of law says there should not be presence of over too much of discretionary power. So the rule of law basically says that presence of too much of discretionary power is a threat to the rule of law, right? It can basically promote arbitrary functioning. But nonetheless, we have the provision of discretionary powers with regard to governor, but many times it has been alleged that the governors have not been using this discretionary power very judiciously. For the purpose for which this discretionary provision was kept in the constitution is actually getting defeated, because the governors are not applying their mind while exercising this discretionary power. But many times it is alleged that the governors are broadly working as the agents of the central government, and therefore it has also created some kind of problem in the center state relationship in our country. Now the various examples are there, Maharashtra, and then for example Arunachal Pradesh, you have Uttarakhand, right, where the role of the governor became very critical, and therefore it highlights a major source of problem. And Dr. B.R. Ambedkar basically emphasized on the constitutional morality as integral to separation of powers. So therefore constitutional morality is very important, and it is expected from governors whose position is a constitutional position, that they are supposed to apply the constitutional morality whenever they are in dilemma, whenever they are in ethical dilemma, which course of action that they should take. This is what this is clearly coming from your understanding of the ethics paper, right? So they must actually always take the ethical course of action, and there the constitutional morality should actually guide their course of action. And finally, for those aspirants who are specifically preparing for the APSC mains, we have a GS 5 paper which is very Assam specific issues, which deals with Assam specific issues. And here we have many governance challenges, like for example we have the border disputes, Assam, Mizoram, Assam, Meghalaya, and the 6th schedule autonomy, right? So this actually requires balanced center state relations and judicial intervention. So if there is no balance in the center state relation, so then Northeast or specifically Assam may also be affected by that. So for example the Supreme Court in many cases have mediated the interstate disputes, and therefore if the Supreme Court has to mediate the interstate disputes, the independence of the judiciary then becomes all the more crucial and important, right? Now we have like for example we can go on. We have these various instances of conflicts, but I'll not, for the paucity of the time, I'll not go into the detail of it. But let's now briefly and quickly come to the challenges to the separation of powers. Of course, as we have already highlighted some of the major sources of problem or irritation, where it basically it reflects that there are troubles, there are challenges with regard to the separation of powers. Excessive use of ordinances, for example, we have many times seen that the ordinance route, and many times there is a terminology which has generally been used in a very critical manner, which is to say the ordinance Raj, right? So the ordinance, again, was placed in the constitution for a specific purpose, but now it has been alleged that this ordinance route is actually being abused, and for the purpose for which it was placed in the constitution, the very purpose is actually getting defeated when we are using the ordinance route to bypass legislative scrutiny, and thereby this actually undermines the spirit of parliamentary democracy, and in the process it actually dilutes the legislative accountability, right? And many a times when the parliament loses such opportunities to deliver, and debate and deliberate on some of the important issues, that actually defeats the whole purpose of the parliament as the highest deliberative organ of the state also. Now, land acquisition ordinance, you can find the example, right, which was, the Land Acquisition Act was brought in 2013 and was again, promulgated thrice within a year, despite strong parliamentary opposition, and it has actually bypassed legislative debate and triggered criticism for from civil society and opposition leaders for executive overreach. Similarly, Kerala University ordinance, case also can be discussed. Now, executive interference, we have seen how the post or the office of the governor has been actually politicized, and there is a greater misuse of Article 356 to which basically disrupt the state autonomy and legislative processes, and this is not healthy for the for both the doctrine of separation of powers and the federalism. Examples, for example, we have the various examples for that, Punjab, Tamil Nadu, West Bengal, and this conflict, the way the conflict is increasing between the state, legislature and the governor, actually it is getting intensified, and which is not in the best interest, right? So therefore, we have the Sarkaria Commission, which recommended that, that the governor's discretionary powers should be limited, but nonetheless even today we hear the cases of misuse of governor's office, and it continues to be a major source of irritation or concern, a major source of problem in the doctrine of separation of powers in Indian context. Similarly, we have judicial activism versus overreach. Now, as we all know, judicial activism has played a very important role. In fact, it has been it has actually played a very proactive role in promoting justice and protecting the interest of the poor and the marginalized sections of the society, starting from the examples of Bihar under trials, right? So the judicial activism has been playing a very important and productive role, but at the same time there is another side to it also, which is like whether the judiciary is actually being over enthusiastic and intervening into the domain of the legislature, right? And so many times the judiciary's over activism has been actually criticized, So for example, Tamil Nadu Assembly passed a law to exempt students from NEET, citing socio-economic disparities. The Supreme Court in that particular case struck down the demand, leading to accusation of judicial insensitivity to local realities, right? So this way, many times, for example, with regard to Delhi's air pollution cases, from many times the role of the judiciary has been criticized. Sabrimala verdict, for example, Supreme Court basically lifted the temple entry ban, right? And Supreme Court basically then allowed the entry of women of menstruating age into the Sabrimala temple, and this basically triggered constitutional versus faith-based conflicts and nationwide protests, and therefore, with regard to this judicial activism and judicial overreach, we have basically understood that whereas the judicial activism has played a very important and a very positive role in our country, but also this can be very dangerous when the judiciary becomes overactive and unnecessarily intervenes into the domain of other branches. This can actually, problematize the balance, and defeat the very purpose of the, defeat the very concept of the separation of powers in the Indian context. And it is in this context that Pratap Bhanu Mehta has maintained that judicial governance may empower or erode democracy, right? So it has both the prospects based on, therefore context and restraint, right? So it can either promote democracy and it can also basically compromise the very constitutional provisions also. Now, what are the recent trends? We have seen centralizing policies, for example, GST, CA, these basically challenge the state autonomy, and they, these basically such policies in the process also test the separation of powers, and Delhi Ordinance Bill, for example, right? Center passed a law overriding the Supreme Court ruling, right? So the Supreme Court ruling was bypassed by the center, which then, passed a law and gave LG the control over services in Delhi. It curtailed the elected government's power, and we have seen how the elected government's power were reduced. This raised serious concern about federalism and executive overreach. And technology and governance also, there also we can relate executive's use of surveillance laws. For example, IT Act, right, raises judicial scrutiny over privacy rights. Privacy, which is again another important fundamental rights of ours, can be compromised for surveillance purposes, right? And that way also we can link with, certain GS papers. For example, Pegasus surveillance case, where Supreme Court's intervention into surveillance allegations reaffirmed judicial role in checking executive excesses, highlighting that the separation of power in action, that it is ongoing, right? So Digital Personal Data Act, it grants broad executive access to data, raising privacy and oversight concerns. So this way we have many challenges, So, but now that we have understood the concept and the theme of our discussion in detail, it is very important for us to see what kind of questions that have been asked on this topic in the previous year. So what are the PYQs, previous year questions, right? And if you have traveled with me this far, I would request you to kindly like it, and most importantly, please drop your comments. Do give your feedbacks. Your feedbacks are extremely important for us, because it is based on your comments and feedbacks that we can actually improvise our sessions, and we can actually remodule and redesign our sessions as per your specific requirement. The objective is to help you in your preparation for the mains exam, and therefore if you write to us, if you give your comment, we'll be able to help you more effectively. So with that, let me bring some of the previous year questions and probable questions for 2025 and 26 rather, right? So do you think that the Constitution of India does not accept the principle of strict separation of powers, rather it is based on the principles of checks and balances? Explain, right? So here it is asking about the what are the constitutional provisions, and how whether it is based on the principles of checks and balance. Now in the UPSC again in 2020 asked another question: judicial legislation is antithetical to the doctrine of separation of powers as envisaged in the Indian Constitution. In this context, justify the filing of large number of public interest petitions praying for issuing guidelines to executive authorities, right? Now there is in 2023 constitutionally granted judicial independence is a prerequisite of democracy. I think from this discussion, this question is very much clear to you, that why this constitutionally granted judicial independence, that like therefore you have to mention what are the constitutional provisions which basically grant independence to the judiciary, and why this is sacrosanct and why this is crucial, so that our democracy can flourish, and what are the threats if the independence of the judiciary is not protected through constitutional provision. What are the dangers, and how our democracy can actually be compromised, right? So that way you will be able to answer those questions. Now let's see probable question, the doctrine. So basically, because we do not have the time to go into the detail of it, and that's why I'm just skipping some of the important portions also, because but if you write to us, if you join us, if you get in touch with us, we will be able to provide you more detailed and specific guidance as how to write answers, how to make your answers very enriching, where basically your chances of scoring better marks are there, right? So that kind of hand holding will be provided to you if you reach out to us, if you contact us at CSAP IS Academy. We are always committed to help you in your preparation and contribute in your journey of becoming the bureaucrat, and we would like to hope that you will use the power much more ethically, and therefore will bring about a transformation in the society. So with that hope and objective, we at CSAP IS Academy would be more than willing to help you in whatever ways that we can possibly do. So please reach out to us, do leave your comments, feedbacks, and we will accordingly work upon it so as to help you in the best possible manner. Now, what is the probable question? Let's just try to formulate one question. Okay, the doctrine of separation of powers is not rigidly applied in India, but its spirit remains foundational to constitutional governance. In light of recent developments such as the Delhi Ordinance Bill 2023, Digital Personal Data Act 2023, and the Pegasus surveillance case, critically examine the evolving challenges to the separation of powers between the legislature, executive, and judiciary. So you see, so here answering this question, you just not only need the static component, right, but you also need to update yourself with the current affairs, with the current debates, and that is what we have actually tried to do in this session, that we have brought about the recent developments, the examples, because many times the questions will be formulated in such a manner so as to test whether you can incorporate the current developments in your answer or not, right, or you are just familiar with the static part and you are not able to make your answer very relevant by citing contemporary developments. Now that is something where you need to develop skills. So mains is about learning that art of making your answers very relevant, right? And we at CSAP IS Academy are committed. We are the group of trained faculties. Like for example, I myself have taught in Delhi University for the last 10 years, and I have also helped many of my students through mentoring and other kinds of guidance by evaluating their answer writing abilities and giving them specific inputs. I have also helped many of my students clear both UPSC and APSC and other competitive exams. So with that kind of an expertise and exposure, we are here to help you very specifically to prepare for the mains, right? So if you like, you can reach out to us and we will be more than happy to help you in your journey. So now what is the way forward? How do we strengthen this separation of power doctrine, right? So we need institutional reforms, right? For example, the major sources of problem. What are the major sources of problem? We need to correct them. We need to rectify. We need to work upon those areas. And as various commissions from time to time has also pointed out, we need to basically codify governors' discretionary powers, right? And the concept of rule of law also says that too much of discretionary power can be very dangerous, and limit ordinance use. As I already said, the ordinance Raj, the critical concept of ordinance Raj, right? So we need to basically limit the ordinance uses so that it is used only as per the spirit in which this provision was actually incorporated in the constitution. Now judicial restraint. Judiciary should also avoid policy making because it is not the prerogative of the judiciary, and judiciary, of course then the constitutional supremacy is there. And legislative accountability, basically strengthen parliamentary committees for oversight, and then regional focus, empower autonomous councils under 6th schedule through judicial and legislative support, right? For example, we have the autonomous councils, right? So we need to give more power to them, more support, and for balanced center-state relations. The strength of democracy lies in the delicate balance of its three pillars. So we need to be able to balance these pillars, right? So the delicate balance amongst these three pillars becomes all the more important, right? Now finally, separation of powers is the backbone of India's constitutional democracy, as we have already highlighted, and it ensures that no organ of the state actually oversteps its mandate, right? And this is very important so that they do not cross their jurisdiction and unnecessarily enter into the domain of others by creating a sort of imbalance, so that becomes very important. The doctrine in India is not mechanical but moral, right? It derives its strength from a shared constitutional culture rather than the rigid institutional compartments, right? As I already told that it is in this case we also have interdependence. So the shared, next, the robust separation of power basically demands not only institutional design but also democratic ethos. We also need to function upholding those ethical values, right? All those people who hold important constitutional position, particularly they need to apply the constitutional morality in their functioning, right? And reviving this constitutional culture is crucial for transforming Indian democracy from a procedural framework into a truly just and ethical system. By curbing institutional overreach and resisting political capture, India can actually fortify the principles of justice, unity and democratic resilience. So this way I think we have summed up this discussion on the doctrine of separation of powers, which is actually the bedrock of Indian democracy. And therefore this separation of power basically highlights that the important three branches of governance should perform their constitutional role and function without unnecessarily overstepping their jurisdiction and entering into the domain of others to create imbalance in the functioning. So the harmonious relationship between these three branches again becomes all the more important, because we have functional independence, but at the same time we have interdependence where they need to work in a very shared manner, right? So that's why it becomes all the more important that these three branches actually perform in a very harmonious manner without unnecessarily intervening into the domain of others, right? And we have also discussed that how this concept has evolved and how there have been many challenges to the doctrine of separation of powers, but any major threat and defeat of this very doctrine of separation of powers would be actually a defeating sign for our democracy, and our constitutional democracy would be actually get compromised if this balance of power is basically it gets derailed. And therefore it becomes all the more important to uphold this separation of power and constitutionally designed separation of power, and there must be a harmonious relationship between the various branches of the governance. So with this I would like to wrap up today's session. I hope the session has been very effective and meaningful for you, but what you can do is that you can write to me, you can drop your comments, because it is only based on your comments. Many times you people have been giving feedbacks to me very personally, but I would request that if you can drop your comments in the comment section, that would actually help us, our team members also, so as to understand the requirements, specific requirements of the students, because whatever we are doing here, it has to be student oriented. It must benefit our students. If it benefits and if it helps you, then we would be more than happy. And for that, even if we need to do certain changes, we need to introduce some other mechanisms, we are all willing to do that if that can actually help you in your exam preparation. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for joining and continuing your support, and we at CSAP IS Academy are dedicated to help you in this preparation journey, and we will continue to come up with other important topics in the coming days based on your feedbacks and comments. Till then, you can continue to prepare for your mains, and I would like to once again thank all of you for joining and watching this session so very attentively, and thank you for that. And I would like to wish all of you all the very best in your preparation, and I wish you the best in your life. Thank you very much.